What happens to a human being when the last breath leaves the body? To modern ears, the question sounds spiritual, private, almost invisible. But to the people of ancient Sumer, death was not an ending that dissolved into silence. It was a crossing, a movement, a strange relocation from the warm world of sunlight, bread, music, and family into a hidden region beneath the earth, where the dead continued in a form that was neither fully alive nor completely gone. The Sumerians lived in a landscape where the boundary between life and death was everywhere. The rivers rose and withdrew. Seeds were buried in the ground and returned as grain. Cities collapsed into mud brick ruins and were built again over their own bones. Every year, the fields seemed to die under heat, then awaken with water. Nothing simply disappeared. It changed state. And perhaps this is why their oldest stories speak of human life as something shaped from clay, animated by something mysterious, and eventually pulled back toward the dust from which it came. Imagine the scene, a flat land between the Tigris and Euphrates, dawn spreading over reed marshes, temple towers rising from city walls, workers carrying baskets of earth, scribes pressing wedge-shaped signs into wet clay, priests washing statues of gods as if those statues were living beings. Somewhere beyond the gates of the city, a family gathers around a burial. They place offerings near the body, food, drink, small objects of meaning, not because they believe the dead are simply asleep, and not because they imagine the dead have vanished. They do it because the dead still need something. This is one of the first mysteries. If death was final, why feed the dead? In Sumerian belief, a human being was not imagined exactly as later religions would describe the soul. The words and concepts are difficult to translate. The dead could become a kind of gidim, often understood as a ghost, shade, or spirit of the departed. It was not the glowing immortal soul of later philosophical traditions. It was something thinner, hungrier, more fragile. A presence that could suffer neglect, a presence that might wander, a presence that remained connected to the living by ritual, memory, and name. This is where the journey becomes unsettling. The Sumerian dead did not automatically enter a paradise. They did not rise into a heavenly realm of reward. Their destiny, as described in surviving myths and literary texts, was usually the netherworld, a shadowed domain below. It was not always shown as a place of moral punishment. It was more like a vast house of endings, a realm where kings, servants, warriors, mothers, children, priests, and strangers were gathered under the same terrible law. All status weakened there. All beauty faded there. All names depended on whether the living still remembered them. What if the first thing every soul had to face was not a judge, not a monster, not a flame, but the loss of importance? The ancient Sumerians built some of the earliest known cities in human history. Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash. These were not small villages. They were complex urban worlds of canals, temples, administration, craft production, trade, and ritual. Their scribes recorded grain rations, legal agreements, royal inscriptions, hymns, myths, laments, and prayers. They were practical people, but they were also haunted by cosmic questions. Who made human beings? Why must humans work? Why do the gods remain powerful while humans decay? Where does breath go when the body becomes still? In many Mesopotamian traditions, human life is connected to divine intention. Myths describe humans as made to serve the gods, to maintain temples, to provide offerings, to keep the cosmic order functioning. The body belongs to Earth. The animating force belongs to a mystery greater than the body. Yet the texts do not give us a simple doctrine of rebirth in the later sense of reincarnation. They do not say, clearly and systematically, that every dead person returns in a new body. That silence matters, but silence is not emptiness. Within the myths, rituals, and symbols of Sumer, there is a repeated pattern: descent, strippings away, darkness, judgment or confrontation, exchange, return, renewal. The pattern appears in stories of gods, cities, kings, seasons, and memory. It does not prove that Sumerians believed in rebirth exactly as later traditions did, but it reveals something deeply important. They imagined existence as a cycle of loss and restoration, burial and emergence, disappearance and return. The first doorway into that mystery is clay. Clay was everywhere in Sumer. It formed houses, tablets, bowls, ceilings, bricks, and images. Clay could preserve a message for thousands of years, yet it came from mud underfoot. It could be shaped, dried, broken, soaked, and reshaped. When scribes wrote on clay, they were using the earth itself as memory. When builders raised cities from mud brick, they were lifting civilization from river soil. When myths speak of humans formed from clay, they connect the body to the same substance as the city and the tablet. A human life, in this view, is not separate from the earth. It is earth given form, but form is not enough. Something must enter the clay. This is the second mystery. What makes shaped matter become a living being? The Sumerians did not describe human consciousness in modern scientific language. They did not speak of neurons, brain chemistry, or evolutionary cognition. Their world was symbolic, divine, relational. Life was not merely a biological event. It was participation in a cosmic arrangement where gods, humans, animals, rivers, stars, cities, and the dead all occupied their appointed places. Yet even in this ancient world, the difference between a body and a living person was obvious. Breath mattered, voice mattered, name mattered, memory mattered. A corpse might still look like the person, but something had withdrawn. Something no longer answered. This absence was not treated casually. Death rituals were not only acts of grief, they were acts of protection. They helped place the dead where they belonged. They helped prevent disorder between the world of the living and the world below. The dead who were properly buried and remembered could remain part of the family structure. The neglected dead could become restless, dangerous, or pitiful. In that detail, the Sumerian afterlife becomes deeply human. A person feared not only death, but abandonment, to die without descendants, without offerings, without someone speaking your name, was a terrible fate. The dead existed in relation to the living. The living existed under the gaze of ancestors. Memory became a bridge. Forgetting became a second death. And here, the idea of rebirth begins to take on a different shape. Not necessarily rebirth as a soul entering a new infant body. Not necessarily rebirth as a doctrine of karmic return, but rebirth as continuation. Through name, ritual, lineage, story, and cosmic renewal. A person could live on in the household cult. A king could live on in inscriptions. A city could live on by being rebuilt. A god could descend and rise. A field could die and become grain again. Could the ancient scribes have seen all existence as a fragile negotiation between disappearance and return? The answer hides inside their view of the underworld. The Sumerian netherworld was often imagined beneath the earth, reached by descent. To enter it was to go down, down into dust, down below the visible order, down past the bright world of temples and markets. This downward movement is not random. In agricultural societies, the earth is both tomb and womb. Seeds vanish underground before they return. Bodies vanish underground and do not return in the same form. Clay receives both writing and burial. The ground keeps secrets. For the Sumerians, those secrets were not abstract. They were present in the city itself. Beneath every temple platform were older levels. Beneath every street lay broken pottery, ash, bones, bricks from forgotten buildings. Cities in Mesopotamia became tells, great mounds made from centuries of human occupation. People literally lived on top of the remains of those who came before them. Imagine walking through Uruk at twilight, hearing the sound of animals, water, distant song, and knowing that under the packed floors were earlier houses, earlier offerings, earlier names. The past was not behind them. It was underneath them. What if death was imagined the same way? Not gone, but below. Not erased, but buried. Not free, but waiting in darkness. This does not mean the Sumerians believed the dead were waiting happily for transformation. Their texts are often bleak. The dead eat dust. The underworld is gloomy. Its inhabitants are weak. They depend on funerary care. But precisely because the picture is so stark, every exception becomes powerful. Every myth of return becomes charged with meaning. If nothing escapes the netherworld, then the being who returns has crossed the impossible boundary. That is why the journey of a divine figure into the world below was never just a story about travel. It was a story about the deepest law of existence. No one enters darkness unchanged. No one returns without a cost. But the first human being does not begin in the underworld. The first human begins as formed matter. Clay, blood in some later traditions, divine planning, breath, labor, obligation. The Sumerian imagination did not separate creation from service. Humans were made within a world already ruled by gods, already filled with needs and hierarchies. To be alive was to carry responsibility. To die was to enter another form of dependency. This creates a strange mirror. In life, humans fed the gods. In death, humans needed the living to feed them. The same pattern reverses. The servant becomes dependent. The provider becomes hungry. The voice becomes silence. The remembered one becomes the one who needs remembering. This is not only mythology. It is psychology written in ritual form. Every culture must face the terror that personality can disappear. Sumer answered that terror with clay tablets, names, offerings, and stories. Write the name, speak the name, pour the water, place the food. Keep the dead from dissolving into nothing. But there is a deeper question hidden inside the ritual. If the dead depend on memory, then what is a soul without memory? This question reaches beyond archaeology. It touches the center of identity. Are we our bodies? Our names? Our family lines? Our deeds? Our breath? Our memories? If everything that made a person recognizable is stripped away, what remains beneath? The Sumerians may not have answered in the language of later rebirth traditions, but their myths seem to circle the same abyss. A being moves from form into formlessness, from status into nakedness, from speech into silence, from the world of the living into a realm where identity thins. And perhaps that is the first thing every soul must face before any kind of return can be imagined. The loss of the life it thought it owned. This is why the clay matters. Clay can hold a shape, but it is not the shape. Clay can bear a message, but it is not the voice. Clay can preserve a name long after the mouth that spoke it has turned to dust. The Sumerian scribe pressed signs into wet earth because memory needed a body. Without a body, even words vanish. So, what is the human being? A body shaped from earth, a breath that arrives and leaves, a name carried by others, a shadow that may descend, a memory fighting against dust. In the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of tablets survived because fire hardened them, burial protected them, and time forgot to destroy them. Yet many are broken, many are incomplete. Some myths survive only in fragments. Lines are missing exactly where modern readers most want answers. The ancient voices speak, then vanish. They reveal a door, but not always what stands behind it. That incompleteness is part of the power. The Sumerians left no simple map of the soul's rebirth. They left something more haunting images of descent, hunger, memory, divine creation, and the terrible weakening of identity after death. They left stories where even gods must enter darkness according to rules. They left rituals suggesting that the dead are never entirely beyond relationship. They left clay signs that still ask us to consider whether life is a temporary shape given to something older than the body. And beneath it all remains the oldest fear. When breath leaves the clay, does the self continue, transform, wait, or fade? The first answer from Sumer is not comforting. The soul must face dust. It must face dependence. It must face the possibility of being forgotten. It must face a realm where power no longer protects it and where memory may be the last remaining thread. But another question rises from the darkness. If the dead become shadows beneath the earth, why do the myths keep speaking of descent as though something may still return? What would remain of a soul if every sign of identity were taken away? The Sumerian myth of Inanna's descent begins with a decision that feels almost impossible to explain. A goddess of love, power, fertility, warfare, beauty, and kingship turns her attention towards the realm below. She is not dead. She has not been murdered. No enemy drags her there. She chooses to go. This is the first strange detail. The text does not present Inanna as a frightened human soul. She is divine. She belongs to the world of temples, songs, royal authority, sexuality, and cosmic force. Her presence fills the city of Uruk with sacred energy. Kings seek legitimacy through her. Hymns praise her as radiant and dangerous. She is not a passive figure. She is ambition in divine form, and yet she goes down. Why would a goddess who already possesses so much power descend into the land where power becomes useless? In the ancient account, Inanna prepares carefully. She does not enter the netherworld empty-handed. She dresses herself in symbols of authority: a crown, beads, a breastplate, a measuring rod and line, a royal garment. Each item matters because none of them are merely decoration. In Mesopotamian thought, clothing and insignia could reveal rank, divine function, cosmic order, and social identity. What a being wore announced what that being was allowed to do. So Inanna approaches the underworld not as a beggar, but as a queen. The image is cinematic. A goddess adorned in brilliance walking toward darkness. The bright world of the living behind her. The sealed realm below ahead of her. The great gate of the netherworld standing like a wound in the earth. The silence waiting. At the entrance, she meets Neti, the gatekeeper. He does not welcome her as honored royalty. He questions her. He carries word to Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, who receives the news with anger, pain, or fear, depending on how one reads the myth. The underworld is not a place where upper world power is allowed to enter untouched. It has its own laws, its own ruler, its own order. Then comes the most haunting pattern in the story. There are 7 gates. At each gate, Inanna is stopped. At each gate, something is removed. She asks why. The answer is chilling in its simplicity. The rights of the underworld are perfect. They must not be questioned. This is not a negotiation. It is a law. The first gate removes one sign of her power. The second removes another. Then another. Then another. Piece by piece. The goddess is stripped of what made her recognizable in the world above. Her crown is taken. Her ornaments are taken. Her symbols of rule are taken. Her garments are taken. By the time she reaches the throne room of Ereshkigal, she is naked and bowed low. The image is disturbing because it is not just humiliation. It is transformation. Inanna does not merely lose clothing. She loses layers of identity. The underworld does not ask what she owns. It removes ownership. It does not ask what she rules. It removes rule. It does not ask what others call her. It removes the signs by which others recognize her. What if the 7 gates are not only doors in a mythic landscape, but stages in the collapse of the self? Ancient texts do not explain the 7 gates as a psychological map. That would be a modern interpretation. But the pattern is difficult to ignore. The descent is not random. It is ordered, repetitive, ritualized. Each gate brings Inanna closer to the state of the dead, where status from the upper world carries no protection. For archaeologists and historians, the myth belongs to a world of city temples, sacred offices, ritual performance, and divine kingship. Inanna was one of the most important deities in the Sumerian religious imagination, especially associated with Uruk. Her myths are not simple stories for entertainment. They are layered compositions that may reflect cultic practices, political theology, seasonal symbolism, and the tension between life-giving power and the realm that consumes life. But the ancient account itself is stranger than any simple explanation. Inanna reaches Ereshkigal. She is judged, or at least confronted, by the powers of the underworld. Then she dies. The text describes her body as a corpse, hung like meat upon a hook. A goddess who entered blazing with authority is reduced to a lifeless object suspended in the realm below. This is one of the most shocking images in ancient literature. The divine body becomes powerless. The queen becomes a thing. The one who inspired desire becomes an image of death. And the myth forces a question no listener can easily escape. If even a goddess must be stripped, judged, and hung in death, what could a human soul hope to keep? The 7 gates make the underworld feel less like a destination and more like a process. The one who enters is not simply transported. The one who enters is undone. Every layer must be surrendered. Public identity, sacred title, beauty, authority, protection, pride. Even the posture of standing upright is lost. This pattern appears in many religious traditions, but the Sumerian version has its own severity. In Egypt, the dead could be equipped with spells, names, and knowledge to navigate the dangers of the beyond. In later Greek tradition, shades crossed into Hades, sometimes with coins, memory, or judgment attached to their journey. In Mesopotamia, Inanna's descent shows a darker rule: no brilliance from the upper world passes below without being diminished. The comparison must be handled carefully. These traditions are not the same. They developed in different cultures with different texts and rituals. But scholars often notice that ancient peoples imagined death as a crossing through thresholds, guarded passages, or trials. The human mind seems drawn to the idea that death is not instant understanding. It is a passage through loss. Inanna's story gives that loss a shape. 7 gates, 7 removals, 7 moments where the self asks, why? And the answer is, because this is the law. The number 7 carried importance across Mesopotamian culture. It appears in divine groupings, ritual patterns, cosmic symbolism, and literary structures. Modern interpreters sometimes connect the 7 gates to celestial cycles, ritual initiation, or symbolic completeness. Yet the text does not give a single official explanation. This uncertainty is important. The number is meaningful, but its meaning is not locked into one answer. Could the gates represent the complete stripping of cosmic authority? Could they reflect a ritual drama once performed in temple settings? Could they encode the movement of the planet Venus? With Inanna linked to the bright star that disappears from the sky and returns, this Venus interpretation is often discussed because Inanna, and later Ishtar, were associated with the planet Venus. Venus appears as morning star and evening star, vanishes for periods, then returns with renewed brilliance. To ancient sky watchers, this disappearance and reappearance would have been powerful. A radiant light sinks from view, enters invisibility, then emerges again. But interpretation is not evidence by itself. The myth can hold more than one layer. It can speak of divine power. It can echo ritual. It can mirror celestial movement. It can dramatize death. It can explore the terrifying fact that identity depends on signs that can be taken away. That is what makes the 7 gates so unforgettable. The gates ask a question every human life eventually encounters in some form. Who are you without your name? Who are you without your possessions? Who are you without beauty? Who are you without rank? Who are you without anyone bowing, praising, fearing, desiring, or remembering you? Inanna's descent does not answer gently. It stages the answer as exposure. At the center of the underworld, every costume fails. Even divinity must stand naked in front of death. Yet the story does not end with her corpse. Inanna had taken precautions. She instructed her attendant, Ninshubur, to seek help if she did not return. This detail matters because the myth presents survival as something requiring relationship, loyalty, and intervention. Inanna's restoration is not achieved by force alone. It begins because someone remembers her absence and acts. Ninshubur appeals to powerful gods. Some refuse. Enki responds. Enki, associated with wisdom, deep waters, magic, and creative intelligence, fashions 2 unusual beings. They are neither grand warriors nor thunderous gods. They are small, strange, liminal creatures, able to enter the underworld without provoking the same resistance. They find Ereshkigal in agony. Instead of attacking her, they mirror her suffering. When she groans, they groan. When she cries out, they answer with compassion. This is a startling turn. The way to release Inanna is not conquest. It is empathy. The queen of the underworld, moved by their response, offers them a gift. They ask for the corpse of Inanna. With the food and water of life, they revive her. Here the myth approaches the edge of rebirth. A dead goddess receives life again. A body hanging in darkness is restored. The stripped one rises, but the return is not free. The laws of the underworld still stand. No one simply leaves without consequence. A substitute must be found. This is where the story becomes morally complicated. Inanna rises from death, but she is not cleansed into softness. She returns with underworld demons who demand another in her place. The myth refuses to become a simple tale of resurrection joy. It says that passage through the realm below creates debt. Return requires exchange. Life restored must be balanced by life surrendered. Modern readers often want ancient myths to offer comfort. Inanna's descent offers something sharper. It suggests that transformation is real, but never cheap. To pass through death and return means confronting not only darkness, but the cost of escaping it. This is why the 7 gates matter for the mystery of rebirth. They show that return is not merely waking up again. It requires reduction. The soul, or the divine traveler, must be emptied of false permanence. The signs that seemed eternal are revealed as removable. The identity that seemed solid is shown to be made of layers. And only when those layers are gone does the hidden question appear. What remains? The ancient Sumerian text does not say, "This is what every soul experiences." It speaks through myth, deity, ritual image, and sacred drama. But myths often reveal what a culture fears most deeply. Here, the fear is not only death, it is arriving at the final gate and discovering that everything you called yourself could be taken. No crown, no garment, no title, no defense, only the exposed being standing where no living power can follow. If rebirth is possible in any symbolic sense, Inanna's descent suggests that something must be surrendered first, not as punishment, perhaps, but as necessity. The seed cannot remain a flower and still enter the soil. The king cannot remain enthroned inside the grave. The goddess cannot carry upper-world splendor unchanged into the kingdom of Ereshkigal. The 7 gates are terrifying because they do not destroy Inanna immediately. They reveal her, layer by layer. They separate power from being, image from essence, possession from self. The myth does not tell us whether human souls pass through 7 literal gates. It gives us a deeper image. Every passage into death requires a stripping away of illusion. And if every soul must lose what it thought made it whole, what hidden self stands waiting at the final gate? What if the place awaiting the dead was not a paradise, not a fire, not a court of reward, but a house where everyone slowly became dust? The Sumerian netherworld was one of the most unsettling landscapes ever imagined by an ancient civilization. It was not described as a shining kingdom above the clouds. It was not a garden prepared for the righteous. It was not a place where the soul escaped the heaviness of matter and rose into pure light. The world below was dim, enclosed, hungry, and quiet. Its atmosphere was not built from flames. It was built from absence, absence of sunlight, absence of strength, absence of music, absence of warm bread and clean water, absence of the living voice. In the surviving traditions, the dead are often imagined as diminished beings, shadows of what they had once been. They do not stride through eternity with glory. They sit in darkness. They eat what is bitter. They drink what is foul. They live in a region where dust becomes both food and environment, as if the dead slowly take into themselves the substance of their own disappearance. This image is hard to forget. The house of dust, a house where the door does not open toward morning, a house where the residents are not healed, but reduced, a house where the great and the powerless share the same downward fate. The Sumerian word often connected with this realm is Kur. Like many ancient words, it carries more than one meaning depending on context. It can mean mountain, foreign land, or netherworld? That alone opens a mystery. Why would a flatland people living in southern Mesopotamia connect the world of the dead with mountains or distant lands? Was death imagined as a remote territory beyond human reach? Was it a depth below the earth? Was it both, depending on the story being told? Ancient texts do not always draw maps the way modern readers expect. They give images, directions, gates, names, and moods. They reveal a landscape through fragments. The dead go down. They enter a place cut off from ordinary life. They dwell beneath, beyond, or away from the visible order. The details shift, but the emotional truth remains steady. Death is separation, not peaceful separation, total separation. Imagine a Sumerian city at night. Oil lamps flicker inside mud brick houses. A temple platform rises like a dark mountain against the stars. Dogs move through narrow streets. A family sits in silence because one place at the household meal is now empty. The body has been buried. The rituals have been performed. Yet the person is not simply gone. Somewhere, according to the imagination of the culture, that person has entered the lower house. Could they hear the living? Could they remember their own name? Could they feel hunger? The ancient material does not answer in a single doctrine. Historians usually describe Mesopotamian afterlife belief as complex, evolving, and often bleak. Different cities, periods, and texts preserve different images. But a recurring pattern is clear: the ordinary fate of the dead was not a joyful escape. It was a weakened existence in a realm that all must enter. This is what makes the Sumerian vision so psychologically powerful. Many later religious systems place moral drama at the center of death. The good are rewarded. The wicked are punished. The soul is weighed, judged, purified, saved, reborn, or condemned. In early Mesopotamian traditions, the emphasis is often less on moral sorting and more on the condition of being dead itself. To die is to lose vitality. To die is to lose social power. To die is to become dependent. To die is to join the great community of shadows. That does not mean morality never mattered in Mesopotamian religion. Justice, oath, order, divine anger, and human wrongdoing mattered deeply in life. Kings boasted of righteousness. Laws invoked gods. Prayers confessed sins. Omens warned of divine displeasure. But the netherworld, as commonly portrayed in Sumerian literary imagination, was not a simple heaven and hell arrangement. The king and the servant both descended. The warrior and the child both became vulnerable. The beautiful body and the aged body both entered dust. Why would a civilization build such a severe picture? Perhaps because the Sumerians watched death without illusion. Bodies decayed. Houses collapsed. Clay walls melted in rain. Canal systems silted up. Fields failed without maintenance. Memory faded if no one preserved it. Their world taught that order required constant effort. Nothing stayed whole by itself. The netherworld is that truth turned into a cosmic landscape, a place where maintenance has failed, a place where lamps are not relit, a place where the dust has won. One ancient composition connected with the netherworld gives a glimpse of the dead in different conditions. The dead person with many sons is better provided for than the one with none. The one who died violently may suffer a different fate from the one who received proper burial. The neglected dead are pitiable. This does not create a modern doctrine of reincarnation, and it does not give a full system of salvation. But it does suggest that the condition of the dead could vary, and that earthly relationships mattered beyond the grave. Here lies a disturbing possibility. In the Sumerian imagination, the soul did not face only death. It faced the consequences of social disappearance. A person without family, without burial, without offerings, without memory, was more exposed in the world below. This makes the afterlife intensely communal. Your fate is not only between you and the gods, it is tied to whether the living continue to acknowledge you. A name spoken by descendants becomes a thread stretched across the abyss. What if memory was not decoration, but protection? Archaeology cannot prove exactly what every person believed. Graves do not speak in complete sentences. A bowl placed near a body can suggest an offering, but it cannot reveal every thought behind the gesture. A tomb can show care, status, family connection, or ritual obligation, but the inner fear of the mourners remains hidden. Still, burial practices across Mesopotamia show that the dead were treated as continuing presences. Bodies were placed carefully. Objects accompanied them. Family spaces and burial spaces could remain closely connected. The dead were not always banished far away. Sometimes they stayed near the house. That detail changes everything. The underworld may be cosmic, remote, and terrifying in myth. Yet the dead could remain socially near through ritual and memory. A grandfather might be below, but also part of the household's unseen structure. An ancestor might dwell in dust, yet still belong to the family line. Death moved a person out of ordinary sight, but not necessarily out of obligation. This tension is one of the great mysteries of Sumerian afterlife thought. The dead are far away, yet close, powerless, yet potentially dangerous, hungry, yet able to receive, gone, yet not gone. It is easy to imagine why ghost traditions developed in such a world. If the dead were neglected, improperly buried, or violently removed from life, they might not rest within the expected order. They could trouble the living. Illness, misfortune, nightmares, and disturbances might be interpreted through the presence of angry or restless dead. Modern scholars study these ideas as part of Mesopotamian religion, ritual healing, and household belief. The ancient mind did not always separate psychology, illness, guilt, grief, and spirit activity into different categories. A haunting could be emotional, it could be ritual, it could be supernatural, it could be all of these at once. Consider the phrase house of dust not only as a place, but as a diagnosis of human pride. Everything people build around the self eventually becomes unstable. Wealth can be lost. Beauty changes. Strength weakens. Cities fall. Records break. Even kings become names pressed into clay, and clay itself can shatter. The underworld tells the living this is where all display ends. There is no audience below to admire your palace, no marketplace to repeat your achievements, no army to enforce your command, no mirror to preserve your face. If rebirth is understood symbolically, then the house of dust becomes the place where false permanence dies. The self that lived by recognition is deprived of recognition. The self that lived by appetite receives dust. The self that lived by authority enters a realm where another power rules. This is not reincarnation as a stated Sumerian doctrine. It is an ancient image of reduction so complete that any future renewal would require something more than personal strength. The dead cannot simply climb out because they wish to. The house holds them. The door closes. The dust settles. Yet the very bleakness of this vision gives it strange depth. A culture that imagined death so darkly also worked intensely to preserve memory. Scribes wrote names. Kings built monuments. Families made offerings. Temples performed rituals. Laments gave voice to destroyed cities as though the cities themselves were grieving beings. Against dust. Sumer raised remembrance. This struggle still feels familiar. Every photograph, inscription, grave marker, archive, family story, and whispered prayer repeats the same ancient impulse: do not let the dead become nothing. Keep the name alive. Keep the voice from fading. Keep one small lamp burning in the house of dust. But the Sumerians knew the lamp was fragile. Many tablets are broken. Many names are lost. Many graves have no story left attached to them. Entire generations have passed into silence so complete that only pottery fragments remain. The house of dust is not only mythic, it is archaeological. It is what time does to civilizations. A buried city becomes a mound. A palace becomes a layer of debris. A life becomes a trace. A voice becomes a sign no one can fully restore. And still, from those broken signs, the dead speak. They do not speak with comfort. They speak with warning. They say that the soul, shade, or remembered self must face a realm where ordinary identity weakens. They say that death is not conquered by status. They say that memory is sacred because forgetting is a kind of darkness. They say that every human life is built on the edge of dust. The house of dust waits not as a punishment for a few, but as the hidden architecture beneath all living things. So the question becomes more frightening. If every soul must enter the house where names fade, who or what decides which names are allowed to endure? Why would the land of the dead be ruled by a goddess who seems to have been taken from the world of the living gods? Ereshkigal stands at the center of one of the darkest mysteries in Sumerian mythology. She is not merely a monster in the depths. She is not a demon waiting to devour souls. She is a queen. She has a throne, authority, servants, messengers, laws, and a realm that even the brightest powers must respect. The dead do not enter an empty darkness. They enter her domain. Her name is often understood as Lady of the Great Earth or Queen of the Great Below. That title alone changes the feeling of the underworld. The lower realm is not chaos without command. It is a kingdom. It is terrible, but not lawless. It is hidden, but not meaningless. It has structure. It has borders. It has a ruler whose presence makes death feel less like disappearance and more like arrival at a court no one can escape. But Ereshkigal's own story is strange. In one Sumerian tradition, when heaven and earth were separated and the universe took shape, Ereshkigal was carried off to the underworld. The wording is fragmentary and difficult, but the image is powerful. A goddess becomes connected to the realm below not by ordinary inheritance, but through a cosmic division. The upper gods receive the visible world. The heavens and earth are assigned. The waters and cities begin to take form, and Ereshkigal becomes the one whose place is beneath. Was she chosen? Was she exiled? Was she sacrificed to cosmic balance? Ancient texts do not give a single complete biography. They give glimpses. This is why she feels so haunting. Other deities are surrounded by hymns of brilliance, temple praise, lovers, battles, and public festivals. Ereshkigal appears behind a door. She is felt through consequences. Her power is not the power of light spreading outward. Her power is the power of a sealed chamber, and in that chamber, every life eventually arrives. Imagine a throne room deep beneath the earth. No sun passes through it. No wind from the river marshes moves across its floor. The walls seem made from packed night and ancestral dust. Around the queen are beings who belong to the lower realm, not as visitors, but as its permanent inhabitants. Messengers come and go. Decrees are carried. Names are received. The dead enter without the strength they once had. At the center sits Ereshkigal. She does not need to chase anyone. All roads come to her. This is what makes her terrifying. Many gods rule by action. Storm gods strike. War gods attack. Love goddesses seduce. Wisdom gods devise. Sun gods cross the sky. Ereshkigal rules by inevitability. Her kingdom expands because time itself delivers subjects to her door. Every birth secretly increases her future kingdom. Every celebration contains one more life moving toward her. Every king who raises a wall is building under her unseen gaze. For ancient Sumerians, the world was not divided into simple good and evil. Gods could be generous, dangerous, unpredictable, protective, violent, wise, jealous, or merciful. Divinity did not always mean moral perfection. It meant power, function, and position within the cosmic order. Ereshkigal's function was terrible, but necessary. Someone had to hold the boundary. Someone had to rule the realm from which ordinary beings did not return. Modern readers often misunderstand such figures by calling them evil. That is too simple. Ereshkigal is not Satan. She is not a tempter. She does not exist to corrupt humanity. She represents the sovereignty of death itself. Her presence says that the underworld is not a mistake in the universe. It is part of the universe. That thought is unsettling. Death is not an accident outside divine order. Death has a queen. This may explain why her role carries both fear and dignity. If the dead must descend, then their realm cannot be completely ungoverned. If grief tears families apart, the myth gives grief a location. If the body returns to earth, the imagination gives the earth below a ruler. In this way, Ereshkigal becomes a divine shape for the most painful fact of human existence. What is loved can be taken into a place the living cannot control. One of the most revealing scenes involving Ereshkigal shows her not in triumph, but in agony. In the descent story, when the rescuing beings enter the lower realm, they find her suffering. She groans like a woman in labor. She cries out in pain. This detail is astonishing. The Queen of the Dead is not portrayed only as cold stone authority. She is in torment. Her body, or divine being, is connected to anguish, pressure, and perhaps birth. Why would the ruler of death be shown in a posture associated with giving life? This is one of the great symbolic shocks in the myth. Ereshkigal's pain has been interpreted in different ways. Some see it as rage, grief, or the suffering of the underworld itself. Some see echoes of birth imagery, as if the lower realm is not only tomb but also womb. Some suggest that her agony reflects the cost of cosmic balance. These are interpretations, not settled facts. The ancient text does not pause to explain the psychology of the goddess. It simply places the listener inside an impossible image. Death's queen is crying out like life is struggling inside her. That image opens a door no doctrine can fully close. If the underworld is only an ending, why does its queen labor? A seed buried in soil disappears from sight. A body buried in earth disappears from sight. One returns as grain. One does not return as the same person. But ancient agricultural imagination naturally saw the ground as double. It receives the dead and nourishes the living. It consumes bodies and produces harvests. It is grave and source together. Ereshkigal may embody that double truth. She rules the place of no return, yet her realm is as hidden in the same earth from which food grows. She is terrifying because she takes. She is mysterious because the world that takes also gives. This does not mean Sumerian texts clearly teach that souls are reborn through her. That would go too far. The evidence does not support turning Ereshkigal into a goddess of reincarnation in any direct or systematic sense. But the symbolism around her makes death more complicated than simple erasure. Her realm is final for the dead. Yet mythic patterns around descent and restoration keep suggesting that the boundary between death and renewal was deeply charged. The queen below is therefore not only a figure of fear, she is a guardian of transformation's most hidden gate. In later Mesopotamian tradition, Ereshkigal is connected with Nergal, a god associated with war, plague, and the underworld. Their relationship appears in Akkadian narratives that differ from earlier Sumerian material. In those stories, the politics of the divine world extend into the lower realm. Nergal enters the underworld, confronts Ereshkigal, and eventually becomes linked with her rule. The details shift across versions, but the larger idea remains striking. The underworld has diplomacy, threat, desire, and power struggles. Even death has politics. This mattered in Mesopotamia because kingship itself was sacred and cosmic. A city needed order because the cosmos had order. Temples mirrored divine households. Palaces mirrored celestial authority. The throne was never just furniture. It was a symbol of legitimate command. So when Ereshkigal sits enthroned below, the myth tells listeners that death is not outside the system of rule. The dead belong to a kingdom whose monarch cannot be overthrown by human pleading. Could the fear of Ereshkigal reflect the fear of absolute authority? A human king could tax, command, punish, conscript, or execute. But a human king still died. Ereshkigal ruled the place where kings arrived stripped of all earthly force. Her throne was higher than earthly thrones precisely because it was lower than earth. It waited beneath every palace. This reversal is profound. The lowest realm holds the final authority. The hidden queen receives the visible king. The silent court outlasts the noisy city. Archaeology reveals the remains of palaces, temples, graves, seals, and tablets. But it cannot uncover Ereshkigal's throne as an object. Her throne belongs to mythic imagination. Yet the concept of that throne tells us something real about ancient thought. The Sumerians gave death a political form because they lived in a world where order, rank, offering, duty, and command shaped daily life. Even the unknown had to be imagined through a structure people could feel. The underworld became a court. The dead became subjects. The queen became the face of the unavoidable. Yet Ereshkigal is also isolated. This is the emotional center of her mystery. A goddess of the great below cannot simply join the feasts above. She cannot rule death and remain among the living gods as one of them. Her power separates her. Her throne imprisons as much as it exalts. She owns a kingdom no one wants to enter. She is sovereign over what everyone fears. What kind of divinity is that? A queen with endless subjects, yet no true escape. A ruler of all endings, yet perhaps the loneliest being in the cosmos. A goddess whose domain grows with every death, but whose victory is made of grief. This loneliness may be why her anger feels more than cruelty. When another divine power approaches her realm, the intrusion is not a simple visit. It threatens the boundary that defines her entire existence. The upper world comes shining into the place assigned to darkness. The living order trespasses into the sealed kingdom. To Ereshkigal, this may not look like courage. It may look like violation. The dead belong to her. The lower realm belongs to her. The law belongs to her, and the law must hold, or the boundary between worlds begins to break. In this sense, Ereshkigal is not merely the enemy of return, she is the protector of consequence. Without her, descent would have no cost, death would have no gravity, transformation would become easy, and myths rarely trust easy transformation. Something must resist. Something must say no. Something must demand payment when life tries to reclaim what darkness has taken. That resistance has philosophical weight. Every human being wants renewal without loss. We want wisdom without pain. We want rebirth without surrender. We want to cross into darkness and come back unchanged, carrying the same pride, the same name, the same face, the same desire, the same certainty. Ereshkigal's throne says this cannot happen. The lower world is not a corridor. It is a kingdom, and every kingdom has a ruler. If the soul enters the domain of Ereshkigal, it meets more than death. It meets the power that keeps death real. It meets the divine refusal to let identity pass through darkness untouched. It meets the queen who knows that no life can become something else until its former shape has been claimed. So the mystery deepens around her throne. Was Ereshkigal imprisoned in the underworld, or was she the only power strong enough to rule it? What if the dead were not only received into darkness, but watched by powers whose names were older than kings? In the Sumerian imagination, the lower world wasn't empty. It had gates, messengers, a queen, rules, and beings who carried authority in places where human voices could no longer argue. Among the most mysterious of these powers were the Anuna, known more widely through later Akkadian as the Anunnaki. In popular modern culture, this name has been pulled into countless theories about ancient aliens, hidden technology, and lost races. But in the ancient texts themselves, the Anuna are not spaceships or engineers from another planet. They are divine beings, a group of gods whose roles shift depending on text, time, and tradition. Sometimes they appear as great gods connected with heaven and earth. Sometimes they are linked to divine assemblies. Sometimes, in underworld scenes, they appear as judges. That last role is deeply important. It suggests that descent into death was not only a movement into silence, it could also become an encounter with divine order. Not necessarily judgment in the later moral sense of heaven for the righteous and punishment for the wicked. The evidence does not support forcing that structure onto early Sumerian belief, but the presence of underworld judges reveals something just as unsettling. The dead, or even gods who enter the realm of the dead, could come under the gaze of powers who determine status, fate, and consequence. The underworld was dark, but not blind. Imagine a chamber beneath the earth where no torch seems to brighten the walls. The air is still. The ground is packed with the dust of generations. At the far end are not human officials, not priests, not kings, but ancient divine figures seated in a solemn assembly. Their faces are difficult to picture because the texts rarely describe them in visual detail. Their power comes from function. They witness. They decree. They fix the result. What if the most terrifying part of death was not suffering, but being known completely by powers you could not deceive? In Sumerian and Mesopotamian thought, judgment was not only a courtroom act. It was woven into the structure of the cosmos. Gods established destinies. They assigned offices. They controlled boundaries. They approved kingship. They responded to oaths. They sent omens. They punished broken order. The universe was alive with decision. Human beings did not live in a neutral space. They lived inside a world governed by powers whose decrees could reach from the stars to the riverbank, from the palace to the grave. This makes the underworld judges more than background figures. They represent the continuation of order when ordinary life has ended. In one of the most famous descent traditions, when Inanna arrives in the realm below, the Anuna are present as judges. The moment is brief, but devastating. The goddess has already been stripped of her emblems. She has crossed the gates. She stands exposed in the domain where her upper world brilliance cannot protect her. Then judgment is pronounced, and she becomes a corpse. The text does not give a long speech of accusation. It does not list moral crimes. It does not explain the reasoning in the way a modern courtroom drama would. That silence is part of the terror. The decision simply happens. Why would an ancient myth make judgment so abrupt? Perhaps because divine judgment was imagined as more final than human explanation. A human court needs witnesses, testimony, dispute, and persuasion. A divine assembly does not always need to explain itself to the one being judged. It decrees, and reality changes. In Mesopotamian religious imagination, words spoken by gods could create consequences. A fate declared by divine authority was not an opinion. It became structure. This idea echoes through royal ideology as well. Kings wanted the gods to establish their rule. City temples sought divine approval. Rituals maintained cosmic favor. The human world depended on decisions made beyond human sight. If life itself was shaped by decree, then death also belonged to decree. Yet there is a problem. Did ordinary human souls face judgment in the same way? The honest answer is uncertain. The surviving Sumerian texts do not give a complete, systematic manual of what every dead person experiences. They do not describe a universal moral trial with clear questions and verdicts for all souls. What they do show is that the underworld has authority, that divine beings can judge within it, and that the condition of the dead could differ depending on burial, memory, family support, and manner of death. So the mystery is not solved by saying, the Sumerians believed exactly this. The mystery lies in the fragments. A divine traveler is judged. The dead dwell under a ruler. Some dead seem better cared for than others. Rituals protect the living from restless spirits. Gods decree destinies. Oaths and justice matter deeply in life. Together, these pieces create a world where death is not morally empty, even if it is not organized like later heaven and hell systems. The Sumerians were also a civilization of records. Their temples and palaces depended on accounting: grain, sheep, workers, fields, beer, oil, offerings, labor days, and land transfers were recorded on clay tablets. Writing itself emerged partly from the need to keep track of goods and obligations. The scribal mind measured, listed, counted, sealed, and remembered. This fact gives the underworld judges another layer of meaning. A society that recorded debts on clay could imagine the cosmos as a place where nothing important disappears unregistered. What if death was the final audit? This is a modern interpretive image, not a direct translation from a tablet, but it fits the atmosphere of Mesopotamian order. The gods knew. The gods counted. The gods received offerings. The gods were invoked in legal agreements. A false oath was not just a social lie. It risked divine consequence. Justice had sacred weight. Later, Mesopotamian traditions make this connection even stronger through deities associated with law, truth, and the sun. Utu, known later as Shamash, was the sun god and a major god of justice. The sun sees what happens in the open world. It travels across the sky, illuminates hidden actions, and in some traditions has connections with the realm below during its nightly course. This does not mean Utu is simply one of the underworld judges in every Sumerian text. Ancient divine roles are not always so fixed, but the symbolic connection is powerful. The power that sees the living world may also relate to justice beyond ordinary sight. The sun watches the day. The underworld holds the dead. Between them stands the idea that nothing is entirely unseen. For an ancient farmer, trader, soldier, priestess, or king, this would have mattered. Human beings can hide things from neighbors. They can cheat measures, break vows, betray kin, pretend piety, rewrite stories. But in a divine cosmos, concealment is temporary. The gods may delay response, but they do not lack awareness. Could the dead carry their hidden lives into the lower realm? The texts do not answer this as directly as later confessional religions might. Still, Mesopotamians' prayers sometimes show people trying to identify unknown sins, seeking relief from divine anger for offenses they may not fully understand. This is a psychologically intense religious world. A person could suffer and wonder, which god did I offend? Which rule did I break? Which ritual did I neglect? Which hidden fault has found me? The anxiety of unseen judgment was not limited to death. It filled life, omens, dreams, illnesses, disasters, and political defeats could all be read as signs that divine order had shifted. The human task was to interpret, appease, restore, and survive. Priests, diviners, exorcists, lamentation singers, and temple officials all participated in this vast negotiation between human fragility and divine will. In that setting, the underworld judges become part of a larger cosmic pattern. They are not isolated figures in a mythic basement. They are the dark reflection of a world where authority flows from heaven to earth to the depths. The living are judged by consequences. Cities are judged by destruction. Kings are judged by whether the gods uphold them. The dead are judged by powers who sit where no appeal can reach. But judgment in Sumerian imagination is not always about guilt. Sometimes it is about place. To judge can mean to assign, to fix, to determine the order of things. The divine assembly decides who belongs where, who receives which destiny, who may cross which boundary. In the underworld, this is crucial. The boundary between living and dead cannot be casual. If anyone could move freely between realms, the entire cosmic structure would tremble. This is why the judges are frightening. They protect the border. They keep death from becoming reversible by desire alone. They make sure that passage has consequence. Here, the question of rebirth becomes more subtle. If there is to be any return, renewal, or transformation, it cannot occur simply because the soul wants it. It must pass through law. Something must recognize the transition. Something must strip away the old state and authorize, resist, or demand the next. The judges represent that stern middle zone between what was and what could become. In psychological terms, they resemble the inner tribunal that appears when a person faces the truth of a life. What did I do with my breath? Whom did I neglect? What did I worship? What did I fear? What did I become while pretending to be someone else? This is not a claim that Sumerian scribes meant the Anuna as psychological symbols. It is a modern reflection inspired by the mythic pattern. Ancient listeners may have heard divine authority, ritual reality, and cosmic order. Modern listeners may also hear conscience, The power of the image is that it can hold both. A soul standing before judges in darkness is also a human being standing before the impossibility of self-deception. No marketplace noise remains. No family praise remains. No royal inscription can speak loudly enough. No ornament can hide the exposed self. Only the decree remains. The Anuna, as underworld judges, do not give us a complete afterlife doctrine. They give us a glimpse of something older and perhaps more disturbing, the belief that even death has witnesses. The dead may be weak, hungry, and dependent, but they are not beyond order. The darkness is inhabited by powers who decide. The realm below is not merely a dumping ground for souls. It is a place where cosmic authority continues in its most silent form. And yet one mystery remains unresolved. If the judges in darkness could fix the fate of even a goddess, what record did they hold over the ordinary human soul? Why would the dead need food if the body could no longer eat? This question opens one of the most intimate doors into the Sumerian imagination. Not the door of kings, not the door of divine battles, not the door of cosmic creation, the door of the family house. A bowl placed near a burial, a cup set down for someone who no longer lifts a hand, a name spoken into the silence, a little water poured into the earth. To modern eyes, such gestures may look symbolic. Acts of mourning, expressions of love, ways to help the living accept loss. But in ancient Mesopotamia, offerings to the dead were not only emotional, they belonged to a serious system of obligation. The dead remained part of the household's unseen life. They were gone from the table, yet still connected to those who ate at it. They had entered the lower realm, yet their condition could still be touched by the living. This is one of the strangest and most moving ideas in Sumerian religion. The dead could suffer from neglect. A person might die, be buried, and pass into the hidden world, yet still depend on descendants for care. Food offerings, drink offerings, funerary rites, and the preservation of names helped sustain the relationship between the living and the dead. The exact practices changed across time and place, but the underlying fear is clear. If no one remembered you, if no one poured water, if no one called your name, your existence below became poorer, thinner, more desolate. Death did not erase dependency. It transformed it. Imagine a small home in a Mesopotamian city. The walls are made of mud brick. The floor is packed earth. The air smells of barley, oil, smoke, wool, and river clay. Children move in and out of the courtyard. A woman prepares bread. A man checks stored grain. Somewhere beneath or near the house may be the remains of ancestors. The family is not living apart from its dead. The dead are folded into the architecture of daily life. This closeness matters. In many modern cultures, cemeteries are separated from houses. The dead are placed at a distance. But in parts of ancient Mesopotamia, burials could occur beneath floors, within domestic spaces, or in close connection with family areas. Archaeologists do not interpret every burial in exactly the same way, and practices varied by period, region, status, and local custom. Still, the pattern shows that the dead were not always imagined as socially distant. They remained part of household identity. The family did not end at the grave. It extended downward. What if ancestry was not only memory, but infrastructure? A household was more than a set of living bodies. It was a chain. Fathers, mothers, children, ancestors, future heirs, property, offerings, names, and duties formed a continuous line. To belong to a house meant belonging to those who came first and those who would come later. the dead depended on descendants, while descendants depended on the legitimacy and protection of the ancestral line. This is why having children mattered so intensely in the ancient world. A son or heir was not only an economic helper or family continuation. In many Mesopotamian contexts, descendants were expected to maintain funerary rites. To die childless could mean losing the regular care that helped the dead endure. This fear appears in ancient texts that describe different fates for the dead, depending on how many descendants they have and whether offerings are made. The dead with many children are imagined as better provided for. The dead with no one are imagined as deprived. This is not a minor detail. It reveals a complete emotional universe. The living feared dying alone. The dead feared being forgotten. The family feared failing its obligations. In this world, food became more than food. It was a bridge. Bread, beer, water, and offerings carried meaning across the boundary. A libation poured into the ground was not merely liquid falling into dust. It was an act of contact. It said, "You are still ours. You are still named. You have not become completely abandoned." Could memory itself have been understood as nourishment? Modern interpretation must be careful. Ancient Mesopotamians likely believed offerings had real ritual power, not simply psychological meaning. To them, the dead were not metaphors. Rituals addressed real, unseen presences. But from a human perspective, the symbolism is impossible to miss. A person lives among the living by being fed. A person continues among the dead by being remembered through offerings. Hunger becomes the image of isolation. Thirst becomes the image of abandonment. There is something painfully recognizable here. Grief often expresses itself through food. Families cook the favorite meal of the deceased. They leave flowers, fruit, coffee, incense, sweets, candles, letters, or small gifts at graves. They gather at anniversaries. They speak to the dead even when no answer comes. Across cultures, the act of giving something to the departed says what words cannot fully say. Love does not know how to stop serving. The Sumerians turned that impulse into sacred duty. Not all offerings were grand. Not every family had wealth. The royal dead might receive elaborate goods and ceremonial treatment, while ordinary people had simpler burials and household remembrance. Archaeology reveals differences of status, but the emotional logic cuts across rank. Whether the offering was rich or humble, the act itself reflected a belief that the bond remained active. And this brings us to a new kind of mystery. If the dead needed offerings, what happened when a city was destroyed? When war came? When canals failed? When famine struck? When families were scattered? When houses burned? When temples fell silent? The dead lost more than monuments. They lost their caretakers. A broken city meant broken rituals. An abandoned neighborhood meant ancestors left without descendants nearby to call them. The destruction of a city was not only a political disaster, it was a spiritual rupture stretching downward into the realm of the dead. This is why Mesopotamian laments for ruined cities feel so powerful. They do not merely mourn buildings, they mourn the collapse of order itself. Temples are abandoned, streets grow empty, songs cease, offerings fail, divine presence withdraws. The living flee. The dead, too, are implicated in the catastrophe because the chain of remembrance has been severed. A city without ritual becomes haunted by neglect. The idea is chilling. Civilization is not only walls and laws, it is the maintenance of relationships with the unseen. When that maintenance stops, the world becomes unstable. The living may suffer from ghosts, guilt, divine anger, or ancestral disturbance. The dead may suffer from hunger, thirst, and obscurity. Order depends on exchange. The dead receive offerings. The living receive continuity. But who benefits more? At first, it seems the dead are the needy ones. They require bread, water, names, and descendants. Yet the living also need the dead. Ancestors give depth to identity. They root a family in time. They justify inheritance. They bind property, duty, and memory into one chain. They remind the living that existence is borrowed, not possessed. The household that remembers its dead remembers itself. Without ancestors, a person becomes isolated in the present. Without memory, a family becomes a temporary arrangement. Without ritual, death becomes pure absence. The offering protects the dead from abandonment, but it also protects the living from meaninglessness. This is where the question of rebirth takes an unexpected turn. In Sumerian evidence, there is no clear universal doctrine that the soul eats offerings until it returns in a new body. That would be a modern invention if stated as fact. But there is a powerful idea of continuation through the house. A dead person continues through descendants who carry the name, preserve the rights, inherit the space, and maintain the relationship. The individual may not be reborn as a new infant in the documented Sumerian sense, but the life of the person enters a chain that keeps renewing itself. The child eats at the table where the ancestor once ate. The heir stands in the house built by hands long gone. The name passes into speech again. The offering descends into the earth. Is this not a kind of earthly rebirth? Fragile and incomplete, but deeply real. The Sumerians lived in a world where identity was never purely individual. A person was a member of a house, a servant of gods, a subject of city powers, a bearer of obligations, a link between ancestors and descendants. Modern people often imagine the self as private and self-contained. Ancient Mesopotamian life was more relational. To be a person was to be bound into networks of duty. This means the dead did not become free simply because they died. They remained bound. Bound to the family, bound to offerings, bound to the underworld, bound to the memory of those who survived them. For a modern listener, this may feel heavy, yet it also carries a kind of tenderness. The dead were not dismissed. Their needs were imagined. Their loneliness mattered. Their condition could still be improved by love expressed through ritual. The living could not rescue them completely, but they could lessen their deprivation. They could make the darkness less empty. A cup of water becomes compassion. A piece of bread becomes remembrance. A name becomes resistance against oblivion. There is also a warning hidden inside the practice. Every person who gives offerings will one day need offerings. Every hand that pours water will become the hand that no longer moves. Every voice that speaks the name of an ancestor will become a name waiting to be spoken. Ritual teaches the living their future role by making them care for those already below. The child watches the parent honor the dead. One day, the child will honor the parent. One day, another child may honor the child. The chain continues unless it breaks. This fragile chain may be one of humanity's oldest answers to death. Not victory, not escape, not certainty. Continuity. The dead survive because the living accept responsibility. The living endure because the dead give them roots. Memory becomes a shared meal across worlds. But memory can fail, names can be lost, houses can collapse, descendants can vanish, languages can die, tablets can break. A family line that seemed permanent can disappear so completely that no one knows where its dead were buried. Then the offering stops. The silence expands. The shade loses its last thread to the world of breath. This is the terror beneath the food of the dead. The soul may not only face darkness, it may face hunger for a world that no longer remembers it. And if memory is the food that keeps the dead from fading, what happens to a soul when the final person who knows its name is gone? What if return from the realm of death was not an escape, but a debt that demanded another life? In the Sumerian imagination, the boundary between life and death was not a curtain one could simply push aside. It was a law, a sealed order, a balance guarded by powers older than human kings. Even when a divine being crossed back from the underworld, the story did not turn into easy victory. The darkness did not release what it had taken without asking for something in return. This is the terrible logic at the heart of Inanna's return. She rises again. She leaves the world below. Breath, movement, and divine force come back to the body that had hung lifeless in the underworld. To a modern listener, this might sound like resurrection, triumph, liberation, the great reversal of death. But the ancient account refuses to make the return pure comfort. Inanna does not come back alone. She is followed. Behind her come beings often described as underworld demons, relentless escorts of the lower realm. They are not casual companions. They are agents of consequence. They have a demand someone must take Inanna's place. The underworld has lost a body, and the balance must be restored. This is one of the oldest and most disturbing rules in myth. Life returned requires life given. The idea is not presented as a moral lesson in the simple sense. It does not say the substitute is chosen because of sin alone, though behavior matters within the story. It does not explain the underworld as a courtroom of personal guilt and innocence. Instead, the myth speaks in the harsher language of exchange. If one rises, another must descend. Why would the Sumerian mind imagine return in this way? Perhaps because nature itself taught a similar pattern. Grain comes from seed buried in the earth. A harvest appears after something has vanished into soil. Families continue because one generation yields to another. Cities are built with the labor and death of countless unnamed people. Renewal is never weightless. It always stands on something surrendered. Inanna's return makes this cosmic truth personal. The search for a substitute begins. The underworld beings seize upon possible victims, but Inanna rejects some of them. She sees those who mourned her properly, those who honored her absence, those who wore signs of grief. They are spared. Their sorrow protects them. Their loyalty becomes a shield. The detail is emotionally sharp. In this mythic world, how one responds to another's descent matters. Mourning is not empty ceremony. It has consequences. Then Inanna finds Dumuzi. Dumuzi is her husband, a divine shepherd figure connected with fertility, kingship, and seasonal abundance. In some traditions, he is youthful, beautiful, beloved. He belongs to the living powers of pasture, flock, milk, sexuality, vegetation, and royal vitality. His presence carries warmth, increase, and desire. He is not an obvious underworld figure at first glance. He is life in its flowering form. Yet when Inanna returns and finds him, he is not mourning. He is seated in splendor. This moment is devastating. The goddess who has passed through humiliation, death, and revival sees her husband occupying a throne-like place, adorned and unbroken, as though her absence has not shattered him. The text presents this as the turning point. Inanna fixes her gaze upon him. The underworld demons close in. Dumuzi becomes the one marked for descent. What exactly has Dumuzi done? The ancient account suggests failure of loyalty, failure of mourning, perhaps failure to recognize the seriousness of Inanna's death. But the myth is more than a domestic accusation. Dumuzi's selection transforms a story of divine descent into a cycle of absence and return, grief and fertility, desire and loss. The husband of the goddess becomes the price, and immediately he tries to escape. Dumuzi flees. He raises his hands in prayer. He seeks help. His body is changed. In different versions and related traditions, he is pursued through spaces that feel both earthly and symbolic. Sheepfolds, fields, homes, the open land, the fragile places where human livelihood depends on animal and plant life. The chase is not only dramatic, it moves through the living economy of Sumerian existence, shepherding, family, agriculture, and divine fate become tangled together. The underworld does not seize an abstract victim. It enters the world of flocks and households. It reaches into fertility itself. Here the myth becomes more complicated than a simple punishment. Dumuzi is not merely destroyed. His fate becomes divided. His sister Geshtinana enters the story as a figure of devotion and sorrow. She mourns him. She seeks him. She offers herself in relation to his suffering. In some versions, the final arrangement allows Dumuzi to spend part of the year below and part above, while Geshtinana shares or alternates in the underworld. This division has often been interpreted as seasonal. Dumuzi's disappearance has been associated with the dying back of vegetation, the heat and barrenness of the Mesopotamian summer, or the rhythm of fertility fading and returning. Scholars debate details, and the surviving sources do not reduce the myth to one agricultural formula, but the connection between Dumuzi, fertility, shepherding, and cyclical absence is strong enough to make the pattern impossible to ignore. Life withdraws, the land suffers, lamentation rises, then life returns, but never permanently. This is crucial. Dumuzi is not granted a simple eternal escape from death. His story circles. He belongs to a rhythm. Part presence, part absence, part lover, part victim, part fertility god, part underworld captive. He becomes a living image of cyclical loss. Could this be one of the oldest forms of rebirth symbolism in Sumerian religion? Not reincarnation as a soul passing from body to body. Not a later philosophical doctrine of transmigration. The evidence does not support that claim as a fixed Sumerian belief. But Dumuzi's pattern does show renewal through recurring descent and return. His life is tied to cycles that humans could see in fields, animals, weather, and ritual time. The god's fate becomes the land's emotional drama. When he disappears, the world grieves. When he returns, fertility breathes again. Ancient communities did not experience the seasons as background scenery. They lived or died by them. The failure of crops could mean famine. The health of flocks shaped survival. Water management determined whether a city flourished or weakened. The loss of fertility wasn't poetic. It was terrifying. So a divine figure who descends into death and returns in rhythm with abundance gave sacred form to anxiety that every farmer, shepherd, ruler, and mother could feel. What if the rebirth of the land required a god to suffer? This is where Dumuzi's story connects to broader ancient patterns, though each tradition must be kept distinct. Later cultures around the Eastern Mediterranean knew myths of dying or disappearing fertility figures. Some comparisons involve Tammuz, the Akkadian form linked with Dumuzi, and later traditions of lamentation. Other cultures told stories of deities connected with vegetation, descent, mourning, and return. Scholars discuss these parallels carefully because influence, similarity, and shared human symbolism are not always the same thing. Still, the pattern is powerful. The life-giving figure vanishes. The mourners cry out. The world becomes wounded. Return becomes hope, but hope remains tied to loss. In Dumuzi's case, lamentation is central. Ancient laments for Dumuzi are filled with grief, searching, and emotional intensity. The god is not remembered as an abstract seasonal mechanism. He is mourned like a beloved one. His mother, sister, wife, or devotees may cry for him depending on the tradition. The landscape itself seems to become a place of sorrow. This grief matters because it transforms cosmic rhythm into human feeling. People do not merely observe that vegetation fades. They weep for the divine youth who has gone below. They do not merely celebrate abundance. They welcome back the one whose absence made the world ache. Could mourning be part of the mechanism of return? In many ancient rituals, lamentation was not passive sadness. It was performed, structured, musical, communal. Lamentation could address gods, cities, temples, or the dead. It could give voice to catastrophe and invite restoration. By naming loss, the community tried to place it within a sacred order. The cry itself became an act of relationship. In the story of Dumuzi, grief is not weakness. It is the emotional bridge between worlds. His sister's devotion changes the shape of his fate. Inanna's anger marks him. The demons pursue him. The underworld claims him. Yet the arrangement that follows gives his story rhythm instead of absolute silence. He is taken, but not erased. Lost, but not lost forever. Bound to death, yet associated with returning life. The price remains. A substitute must descend, but the substitute becomes a cycle. This is the strange genius of the myth. It takes the horror of exchange and turns it into a pattern by which the world itself can continue. The underworld receives its due. The living world receives renewal. The goddess returns. The shepherd god descends. The sister shares sorrow. The year itself becomes marked by divine absence. For the listener, the lesson is not simple comfort. It is more severe. No return is innocent. No renewal avoids sacrifice. No rebirth happens without a shadow entering the soil. This may be why the myth has survived with such force. It refuses to flatter the human desire for painless transformation. Every person wants a new beginning without losing anything. Every kingdom wants renewal without surrendering power. Every civilization wants harvest without burial, memory without grief, life without death. Dumuzi's fate says that the world does not work that way. Something descends, so something may rise. Something is mourned, so something may return. Something beloved becomes the price of continuation. There is a philosophical darkness here. If the soul longs for rebirth, what must it release if a life seeks renewal? What part of the former self must be given over? The ancient text does not turn this into a private spiritual method. It speaks through gods, demons, kinship, fertility, and seasonal rhythm. Yet the question remains painfully human. Every transformation demands a substitute, not always another person. Sometimes an identity, sometimes a pride, sometimes a desire, sometimes a version of the self that cannot survive the passage into a new life. And this makes the Sumerian vision far more haunting than a simple promise of renewal. The question is not whether life can return. The question is what the underworld will demand in exchange. What if rebirth was not only something imagined for gods or souls, but for the entire world? Among the most powerful traditions preserved from ancient Mesopotamia is the memory of a flood so overwhelming that it divides time itself. Cities exist, kings rule, temples rise, people work, animals breathe, names are counted, and then suddenly the world is swallowed by water. The story is not merely about bad weather, it is about civilization being erased, cleansed, judged, and mysteriously allowed to begin again. The Sumerians lived between rivers that gave life and threatened death. The Tigris and Euphrates were not gentle symbols painted on temple walls. They were real forces. They fed canals, watered fields, carried trade, nourished reeds, and made urban life possible in the southern Mesopotamian plain. But rivers also overflowed. They shifted course. They destroyed houses made of mud brick. They turned order into mud. To live in Sumer was to know that water was never only blessing. Water could create a city. Water could bury it. This is why the flood tradition feels so deeply rooted in the land itself. It speaks through myth, but it rises from a world where survival depended on controlling water without ever fully mastering it. Canals had to be dug, cleared, repaired, and defended. Fields depended on irrigation. Too little water meant hunger. Too much water meant ruin. The same element that made grain grow could turn a human settlement into a drowned memory. The ancient account known from Sumerian tradition tells of a great flood connected with divine decision. The surviving text is fragmentary, but the shape of the story is recognizable. Human civilization exists. Kingship has descended from heaven. Cities have been founded. Divine powers oversee human order. Then the gods decide that a flood will come. A chosen human figure, Ziusudra, is warned. He survives the catastrophe. When the waters pass, he offers worship, and in the tradition he is granted an extraordinary destiny, associated with life in a distant blessed place. The fragments do not give us every detail modern readers crave. They leave gaps. They make the story feel like a broken tablet pulled from the edge of oblivion, offering enough to reveal the terror, but not enough to satisfy the hunger for certainty. Who exactly decided the flood must happen? Why did humanity deserve destruction? What did Ziusudra hear? And how did he understand it? What was lost beneath the waters that no scribe ever restored? This is where the mystery begins to widen. The flood is not just an episode of survival. It appears in Mesopotamian tradition as a boundary marker in cosmic history. The Sumerian king list famously arranges kingship around the flood. Kings rule in ancient cities. Then the flood sweeps over the land. Then kingship descends again. Whether this is historical memory, theological structure, political ideology, or all of these woven together, the message is unforgettable. There was a world before the flood. There was a world after the flood. Between them stood destruction. For historians, this does not mean the list should be read as modern history in a literal way. The reigns of early kings are impossibly long. The arrangement serves ideological and mythic purposes. It links kingship to divine authority and presents political order as something that comes from beyond human invention. Yet within that mythic structure lies a striking idea: civilization itself can die and return. Not the same city, not the same people, not the same memory, but the institution of order descends again. Could this be a form of rebirth on the scale of history? Ancient texts describe the flood as a cosmic rupture. Archaeology gives a different kind of evidence. Excavators in Mesopotamia have found flood deposits at some ancient sites, including layers of silt associated with major inundations. But the evidence does not point to one universal flood covering the entire Earth at a single moment. Different sites show different flood layers from different periods, and many places do not show the same pattern. Archaeologists generally treat the mythic flood not as a straightforward newspaper report, but as a tradition that may preserve memories of devastating regional floods, shaped by theology, storytelling, and political memory. This distinction matters. The texts describe a world-destroying flood. Archaeology shows that catastrophic local flooding happened in riverine Mesopotamia. Historians often interpret the myth as a sacred memory of disaster transformed into cosmic meaning. Modern interpretations sometimes see the flood as a symbol of psychological cleansing, civilizational collapse, ecological trauma, or divine reset. These are not the same claims, but together, they reveal why the story endured. The flood speaks to something more than an ancient weather event. It gives form to the fear that everything humans build can vanish. It also gives form to the hope that order can return from ruins. Picture a city just before floodwaters rise. Scribes are storing tablets. Workers are stacking grain. Priests are tending divine statues. Children are running through courtyards. Oxen stand near carts. Potters shape clay beside kilns. Merchants count goods. Families eat in houses that seem ordinary because disaster has not yet arrived. Then the sky darkens. The river begins to climb. Canals overflow their banks. Mud brick walls soften. Doors collapse. Animals cry out. The carefully divided world of street, field, shrine, and household becomes one moving body of water. What happens to names when the tablets dissolve? What happens to offerings when the temples are submerged? What happens to the dead beneath floors when the houses above them are washed away? The flood myth is terrifying because it does to civilization what death does to the body. It strips structure. It removes boundaries. It reduces the proud city to mud. Streets disappear beneath water. Palaces lose their meaning. Fields become indistinguishable from river. The difference between human order and natural force vanishes. In that sense, the flood is the underworld rising upward. Instead of souls descending into darkness, the lower chaos comes to claim the living world. This is not a statement from the ancient tablets in exactly those words. It is a modern interpretive image, but it captures the emotional force of the tradition. The flood turns the earth into a grave. It buries memory under water and silt. It forces creation to start again from silence. Ziusudra's survival is therefore not merely personal luck. In the mythic imagination, he becomes the fragile thread by which the world continues. One human life carries forward worship, memory, and the possibility of renewed order. His survival means the flood does not become absolute erasure. Someone remains to witness. Someone remains to offer sacrifice. Someone remains to bridge the drowned world and the returning world. This is the same deep pattern that appears wherever ancient people imagined renewal. A remnant survives. A seed remains. A name is preserved. A chosen one carries memory across catastrophe. Without memory, rebirth would be meaningless. A world could begin again, but it would not know what had been lost. The survivor is not important only because he lives. He is important because he remembers the world that died. The flood tradition also raises a question about divine regret and divine distance. In later Akkadian flood narratives, the gods are portrayed in complex ways, with fear, hunger, and conflict among them. The destruction of humanity has consequences even for the divine world, because humans served the gods through offerings and temple care. In the Sumerian material, the surviving text is more fragmentary, so one must be careful not to import every detail from later versions into it. But across Mesopotamian flood traditions, One theme remains powerful. Destroying humanity threatens the order that connected gods and humans. If humans were made to maintain the divine household, why would the gods nearly erase them? That question cuts to the center of Mesopotamian religious anxiety. Human beings were necessary, yet vulnerable, useful, yet expendable, loved by some gods, threatened by others, protected through warning, destroyed through decree. The flood makes human existence feel precarious in the most extreme way. The entire species stands where an individual soul stands at death, stripped of control before powers beyond appeal, and yet renewal comes. The waters recede, ground appears, offering is made, kingship returns, cities rise again. This is not a cheerful ending. A reborn world is still built on drowned foundations. The new order carries the invisible weight of the old destruction. Every temple raised on dry land stands under the memory of water. Every king who claims legitimacy after catastrophe rules in a world that has already been judged once. Every city becomes a question: can order endure? Or is it only waiting for the next flood? Here the flood becomes prophecy, without needing to predict a specific future date. It teaches a cycle. Civilization grows confident. It forgets its fragility. It trusts its walls, granaries, rituals, and rulers. Then a force greater than its control arrives. The world is reduced. Only what is preserved with intention survives. Modern listeners may hear climate anxiety, collapse, ecological warning, or historical trauma in the myth. Those connections can be meaningful, but they are modern interpretations. The ancient Sumerian story belongs to its own religious universe. Still, its emotional power crosses time because every civilization knows, secretly, that its order is temporary. The flood asks every age the same question: what are you building that water cannot take? For a human soul, the question becomes even more intimate. If death is a flood of the self, what survives the drowning? Not possessions, not rank, not the body's beauty. Perhaps only what has been made worthy of preservation memory, offering, relationship, divine notice, and the hidden seed of return. But the flood tradition carries one more unsettling possibility. Rebirth may not mean restoration of what was. The world that returns is not the world that vanished. The survivor does not undo the catastrophe. He carries life forward into a changed creation. This means rebirth is not reversal. It is continuation through loss. The drowned city does not rise exactly as it was. The dead life does not return untouched. The soul that passes through destruction cannot remain identical to the self that entered it. Water remembers what it covers. Silt seals the past. New houses rise over buried layers. Children play above forgotten disaster. Kings inscribe their names on a world already broken and renewed many times, and beneath every rebuilt city lies the same warning. If civilization itself must pass through destruction to be renewed, what hidden flood must the soul survive before it can begin again? What does a king do when he discovers that power cannot protect him from becoming dust? Among all the figures who move through the literature of ancient Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh stands apart because his terror feels painfully familiar. He is not only a mighty king, not only a warrior, not only a builder of walls and a companion of gods. He is a man who looks at death and refuses to accept it. His fear is not abstract. It begins with loss. In the later Akkadian epic, Gilgamesh is king of Uruk, a city of walls, temples, streets, and sacred memory. He is described as powerful beyond ordinary humans, partly divine and partly mortal. At first, he seems almost unbearable in his strength. He dominates. He desires. He takes. The people cry out under the weight of his rule, and the gods create Enkidu, a wild man from the steppe, to meet him as equal, rival, and eventually friend. This friendship becomes the emotional center of the story. Gilgamesh, who had known power, discovers companionship. Enkidu, who had lived among animals, discovers human life. Together, they become more than either was alone. They travel, they fight, they seek fame, they confront monstrous forces. They cut their names into the world through action. But fame is not immortality. That is the trap. The ancient hero believes that great deeds can overcome the shortness of life. If the body dies, the name will remain. If the name remains, perhaps death has not won completely. This idea was deeply meaningful in Mesopotamia, where kings built walls, raised temples, commissioned inscriptions, and sought to anchor their memory in clay and stone. A ruler who could not live forever might still make his name endure, but what happens when even fame feels too small? When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is shattered. The death is not distant. It is not a report from another city. It is the death of the one person who had matched him, changed him, and revealed his own heart. Gilgamesh sees the body decay. He sees the companion who once ran, fought, laughed, and breathed become still. The transformation horrifies him because it is not only Enkidu's fate, it is a mirror. He says, in effect, that what happened to his friend will happen to him. This is the moment kingship fails. The crown cannot answer. The wall of Uruk cannot answer. The gods do not hand him comfort. The hero who defeated monsters is defeated by a corpse. Imagine Gilgamesh beside Enkidu's body, refusing to let go, watching for some sign that the friend might return. The chamber is heavy with grief. The strong king becomes a frightened human being. He looks at flesh becoming strange, at the face losing its living presence, at the terrible evidence that identity can withdraw from a body like light leaving a room. What if wisdom begins not when a person learns how strong they are, but when they finally understand what strength cannot do? The ancient traditions around Gilgamesh are complex. In Sumerian texts, his name appears as Bilgames, a heroic figure associated with Uruk and linked to stories of kingship, death, and the netherworld. The long Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, developed later, gathers older materials into a profound meditation on mortality. Historians distinguish these layers because the traditions were not written all at once. The Gilgamesh known today is a literary figure shaped across centuries. Archaeology tells us that Uruk was real, one of the great urban centers of southern Mesopotamia. King lists include Gilgamesh among early rulers, but that does not prove every mythic episode happened historically. Historians often treat him as a legendary king whose memory became transformed by literature. The walls of Uruk, the scribal schools, the temple culture, and the deep prestige of the city gave his story a powerful setting. The texts describe a king. Archaeology reveals the world that could preserve such a king's memory. Historians believe the literary Gilgamesh is a blend of royal memory, heroic tradition, and theological reflection. Modern interpretations see his grief as one of humanity's earliest literary portraits of existential fear. That fear sends him into the wilderness. Gilgamesh leaves Uruk. He abandons the secure world of the city and moves into dangerous spaces. His hair becomes wild. He wears animal skins. He travels through mountains, darkness, and strange landscapes in search of Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted a life beyond ordinary human limits. This journey is not just geographical, it is psychological. The civilized king becomes almost like Enkidu once was, wandering outside the city boundary. Grief reverses him. The man who built order enters disorder. The ruler who commanded people now begs the universe for an answer. He is no longer searching for conquest. He is searching for a way not to die. The path itself is filled with symbols. He passes through regions no ordinary person enters. He meets beings connected with boundaries, taverns, divine knowledge, and distant waters. He crosses the waters of death, a phrase that carries the sound of final separation. Every stage of the journey tells him the same things to different form. Human life has limits, yet he continues. Why does he keep going when every sign tells him the answer will wound him? Because grief does not listen to wisdom at first. Grief bargains. It wanders. It searches for hidden doors. It believes there must be an exception somewhere. If one man survived the flood and received extraordinary life, perhaps Gilgamesh can find the secret. If a plant exists that restores youth, perhaps the body can be renewed. If the gods once gave someone escape, perhaps the law of death can be negotiated. This is the oldest human refusal. Not me, not yet. There must be a way. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, he receives not the simple key he wants, but a story. The flood survivor tells of divine decision, catastrophe, survival, and the rare destiny granted to him. But his immortality is not presented as a repeatable technique. It is an exception, not a path. Gilgamesh wants instruction. He receives perspective. He wants conquest over death. He receives the story of a world once nearly erased. Then comes a test. He must stay awake. It sounds almost insultingly simple compared with the grandeur of his quest. No monster to slay, no mountain to split, no army to defeat, just wakefulness, endurance, attention. The hero who fought terrible beings must face his own body's weakness. He fails. Sleep takes him. This failure is brilliant because sleep resembles death. The king who seeks immortality cannot even master the nightly disappearance of consciousness. His body betrays his desire. His exhaustion overrules his will. While he sleeps, time is marked, and the evidence of his failure accumulates. The lesson is quiet but devastating. The mortal condition is not defeated by heroic intensity. Even the strongest must close their eyes. Yet another possibility appears. Gilgamesh learns of a plant connected with renewed youth. This is not immortality itself, but it carries the fragrance of restoration. He obtains it from the deep, from a hidden place below the ordinary surface of the world. The image is charged with meaning. Renewal lies beneath, in the watery depth, difficult to reach, dangerous to claim. For a moment, hope returns. Gilgamesh does not immediately eat the plant. He thinks of bringing it back, of testing it, perhaps sharing it with elders. This detail makes him more human and more tragic. His quest, born from personal terror, briefly becomes social. He imagines renewal not only for himself. A king who once oppressed his people now considers a gift that might restore others. Then the serpent takes it. While Gilgamesh bathes, a snake smells the plant, steals it, and sheds its skin. The hero loses the prize at the very edge of success. The serpent becomes the creature associated with renewal of skin. While the human king remains mortal, the image is almost cruel in its elegance. Nature displays renewal in front of him, but does not give him the same power. Why does the snake receive what the king cannot keep? Modern readers often see in this episode an ancient meditation on mortality and regeneration. Snakes shed skin and appear renewed, making them natural symbols of cyclic life in many cultures. The text does not need to explain the symbol because the image is visible to anyone who has watched a snake emerge from its old covering. The creature slips away with the secret that humans desire. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. This return is not triumph in the ordinary heroic sense. He has not gained immortality. He has not rescued Enkidu from death. He has not changed the decree of the gods, but he has seen the limits of human longing. He has crossed wilderness, darkness, water, grief, and failure. He comes back to the city and points to its walls. The walls matter now in a new way. At the beginning, walls can look like pride. At the end, they become acceptance. Human beings cannot live forever, but they can build, remember, govern, write, love, mourn, and leave traces for those who breathe later. The wall is not immortality. It is honest mortality shaped into work. This is not a small lesson. Gilgamesh wanted endless life. He receives human meaning. He wanted to defeat death. He learns to return to the city. There is a Sumerian tradition in which Gilgamesh has connections with the netherworld itself, including narratives where Enkidu brings back knowledge of conditions below. Such accounts differ from the later epic, but they share a fascination with the border between living heroism and the fate of the dead. Gilgamesh becomes a figure who stands near that border again and again, not because he escapes it, but because he cannot stop asking what lies beyond it. His greatness does not come from conquering death. His greatness comes from looking directly at it. And this is where the story becomes more than ancient literature. Every human being has a Gilgamesh moment, a death, a diagnosis, an aging face, a ruined plan, a friend gone too soon, a body that no longer obeys, a silence where a voice used to be. Something breaks the illusion that life can be mastered by force. Then the search begins. Some seek immortality through children, some through fame, some through wealth, some through spiritual belief, some through art, some through memory, some through the desperate hope that consciousness has another door. The ancient epic does not mock this longing. It honors it by making it enormous. A king crosses the world because one friend died. That is the scale of grief. That is the scale of love. That is the scale of the human refusal to become nothing. But the answer he receives is not the answer he wanted. Perhaps that is why the story still wounds. Gilgamesh must face what every soul fears before any renewal can be imagined: the collapse of the demand to remain unchanged forever. Immortality, as he desires it, would freeze the self. It would preserve the king, the body, the name, the will. But wisdom asks something harder. It asks whether a person can live meaningfully without possessing eternity. If rebirth means beginning again, Gilgamesh shows the obstacle hidden in the human heart. We do not only fear death, we fear surrendering the version of ourselves that wants to outlast all law. The king returns without the plant. He returns without Enkidu. He returns without eternal life. Yet he returns with knowledge carved deeper than victory. A human life becomes precious not because it escapes ending, but because it must answer ending with meaning. Still, one question remains sharp as a blade. If even the greatest king could not bring immortality back from the edge of the world, what hope remains for the soul that enters death with no crown, no wall, and no name strong enough to save it? What if the soul's final trial is not punishment, reward, or even death itself, but the terrifying discovery that no life belongs only to itself The ancient Sumerian world does not hand us a clean doctrine of reincarnation. It does not give a simple map saying every soul leaves one body, waits in darkness, and enters another body according to a fixed law. That idea belongs more clearly to other religious and philosophical traditions. The Sumerian evidence is older, stranger, and less systematic. It speaks through clay tablets, broken hymns, temple rituals, divine descents, ghostly hunger, forgotten names, ruined cities, and stories where return is possible only through loss. That is what makes the mystery so powerful. The texts do not say, "Here is rebirth." They say something more unsettling. Everything living is shaped, stripped, judged, buried, remembered, exchanged, drowned, renewed, and claimed again by powers beyond itself. A human being begins as earth given form. Clay receives breath. Breath becomes voice. Voice receives a name. The name enters a household, a city, a lineage, a divine order. For a while, the person walks under the sun believing life is solid. There is work to do, bread to eat, family to protect, gods to honor, fields to water, walls to build, promises to keep. Then the shape weakens, the breath leaves, the name becomes dependent on other mouths, the body returns to the hidden ground. This is the first truth. The Sumerian imagination forces into view the soul. Shade, or remembered self, does not carry ordinary life unchanged into the unseen realm. It must face reduction, not as a dramatic metaphor only, but as the deepest pattern repeated through their myths. The bright goddess is stripped at the gates. The dead become shadows in the house of dust. The queen below rules what no king can command. Divine judges fix consequences. The dead depend on offerings. A substitute must descend for another to return. A flood erases a world so order can begin again. A king searches for immortality and returns with empty hands. These are not identical teachings. They come from different texts, traditions, and layers of Mesopotamian thought. But they circle one central wound. Nothing crosses the boundary untouched. If there is a rebirth hidden in these stories, it is not gentle. It is not easy. It is not a comforting promise whispered over fear. It is a pattern of transformation that begins with dispossession. The soul must lose the illusion of owning itself. The life that thought it was complete must discover it was always part of a larger exchange. This is where modern interpretation must stay honest. Archaeologists can uncover graves, temples, tablets, seals, flood layers, houses, offerings, and ruined cities. Historians can compare texts, reconstruct rituals, trace divine names, and explain how Sumerian traditions influenced later Mesopotamian literature. Ancient texts can describe gods descending, the dead needing care, and cosmic order being restored through painful balance. But none of this proves that Sumerians believed every soul reincarnated. The mystery is subtler. Their stories reveal a world where rebirth is everywhere as a pattern, even when it is not stated as a doctrine. The seed goes underground and returns as grain. The city collapses and rises on its own debris. The divine star disappears and shines again. The king dies, but his name is pressed into clay. The ancestor enters dust, but continues through offerings. The world is flooded, yet kingship descends again. The beloved god vanishes, yet fertility returns in season. The tablet breaks, yet its fragments still speak thousands of years later. What kind of universe is this? Not a universe of simple endings, not a universe of simple returns, a universe of costly continuations. This may be the deepest Sumerian answer to the question of what every soul must face. The soul must face the law of belonging. It belongs to earth. It belongs to family. It belongs to memory. It belongs to divine order. It belongs to death. It belongs to forces older than its own desire. Even its name is not entirely its own, because once the mouth is silent, the name survives only if another voice carries it. That thought is both terrifying and strangely tender. A person is fragile because they can be forgotten. A person is sacred because remembering them becomes a duty. The dead are weak, yet they still matter. The living are powerful, yet they will soon need the same mercy. In the Sumerian world, the boundary between the living and the dead was maintained through care. Pour the water. Speak the name. Keep the rites. Do not let the ancestor become abandoned in the dark. These gestures do not create a modern heaven. They do not erase the bleakness of the netherworld, but they show that death was not pure isolation. Relationship continued. And perhaps that is why the Sumerian underworld feels so haunting. It is not filled mainly with personal reward. It is filled with need. The soul faces hunger for memory, hunger for offering, hunger for identity, hunger for some thread back to the world of breath. What is rebirth without memory? A new beginning, perhaps, or a second disappearance. The ancient scribes would not have framed the question in modern terms of consciousness and personal identity, but their texts lead us toward it. If everything visible can be removed, what remains of the self? If the name fades, is the person still present? If the dead depend on the living, is identity something carried between people rather than locked inside one body? If a god must be stripped to return, what must a human soul surrender to be renewed? The answer never fully appears. That is why the tablets still feel alive. Their broken lines do not close the mystery. They preserve it. A complete system would tell us exactly what to think. A fragment forces us to listen. It asks us to stand inside uncertainty, where myth, ritual, archaeology, and longing meet. This uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of the ancient power. The Sumerians were not writing for modern curiosity. They were addressing gods, training scribes, preserving sacred stories, honoring cities, mourning destruction, legitimizing kings, and explaining the invisible rules beneath life. They did not need to answer every question in the form we ask it now, yet their images remain sharper than many answers. A gate where pride is removed, a chamber where judgment is silent, a queen whose darkness has law, a dead person waiting for water, a shepherd god taken into absence, a flood that drowns history, a serpent slipping away with renewal, a king returning home without eternal life. These images gather around the soul like witnesses. They say you cannot keep everything. They say you cannot pass unchanged. They say even return has a price. They say what is forgotten suffers. They say what is buried may still speak. The final mystery is not whether the Sumerians secretly possessed a hidden doctrine identical to later rebirth traditions. That would flatten their world into something easier and less truthful. The deeper question is why their oldest surviving stories keep moving in the rhythm of death and renewal. Why does existence in these texts feel like a series of descents? Why does power have to be stripped? Why does memory matter so intensely? Why does life keep emerging from what should have ended? Maybe the answer lies in their landscape. The rivers gave and destroyed. The soil swallowed seeds and returned food. Mud became tablets, houses, temples, graves, and ruins. Cities stood on earlier cities. The dead lay beneath the living. Every act of building was also an act of covering. Every new layer carried the remains of another world. Sumer itself became a kind of rebirth machine, not because it escaped death, because it kept making meaning from what death left behind. The people vanished. The language ceased to be spoken in daily life. The temples fell. The gods lost their worshippers. The canals shifted. The cities became mounds. The names of ordinary families disappeared into silence. Yet the clay endured. The tablets slept in dust until human hands lifted them again into light. That is the strangest return of all. The dead scribes did not rise in new bodies, but their words returned. Their questions returned. Their fears returned. Their gods, once buried in forgotten libraries, entered the modern imagination. A civilization that feared being forgotten became one of the oldest voices still speaking. What, then, does every soul face on the edge of rebirth? It faces dust. It faces loss. It faces the stripping of borrowed identities. It faces the judgment of order. It faces dependence on memory. It faces the cost of return. It faces the possibility that renewal is not the preservation of the old self, but the transformation of what remains when the old self is gone. That possibility is difficult because humans do not only want life. We want continuity. We want to remain ourselves. We want our memories, loves, faces, victories, wounds, and names to pass through the darkness intact. But the Sumerian myths are not so easily comforting. They suggest that the passage through death, literal or symbolic, demands a surrender deeper than fear. The soul may have to let go of the life it thinks must be saved in order for anything new to begin. Whether these ancient stories preserve religious belief, ritual drama, seasonal symbolism, political theology, or humanity's earliest attempts to understand mortality, they continue to raise questions that remain difficult to answer. They do not give certainty. They give images strong enough to survive the collapse of worlds. A clay tablet, a closed gate, a cup of water for the dead, a name spoken into darkness, a seed hidden in the earth, and somewhere beneath all of it, one final unanswered question remains. If the soul must lose everything that made it recognizable, what is it that returns?